right now. So thank you so much, Dr. Hancock, for joining us today for our Imagine Lethbridge Healthy Cities Forum and to help guide us to have Lethbridge to be one of the healthiest cities in Canada. So more about Dr. Hancock, and I have not included everything, and I feel like I need to do more with my life when I read Dr. Hancock's information for what he's accomplished in his lifetime. Dr. Hancock's main areas of interest are population health promotion, healthy cities and communities, public health, healthy public policy, environment and health, healthy and green hospitals, and health futurism. He's one of the founders of the Healthy Cities and Communities movement, now global, co-authoring with the late Len Dahl, the original background paper for the European Regional Office of the World Health Organization in 1986. And over the past 30 years, he has worked as a consultant for local communities, municipal, provincial, and national governments, healthcare organizations, NGOs, and the World Health Organization. He has a long-standing interest in the relationship between health and the natural environment and built environment. For 4 years, he led a Canadian Public Health Association work group that resulted in a comprehensive discussion paper on the ecological determinants of health. And that was in May 2015. In the past, he co-founded both the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and the Canadian Coalition for Green Healthcare. And in the 1980s, he was the first leader of the Green Party in Canada and Ontario. And outside of work life, he is an enthusiastic Morris dancer and enjoys creating new dances and parody songs, as well as performing as the Green Man in the annual Mummers play and at the annual Jack in the Green Festival in Hastings, UK. And I think he just came from there. He has also been a semi-professional outdoor photographer, and his photography has been shown in a number of juried art shows in Southern Ontario and BC. And you can learn more about Trevor and his various projects at his website. I think Ashley was going to share that in the chat box. So I'll stop sharing. I'll let Dr. Hancock take it over. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to have you here, Dr. Hancock. We really appreciate you taking time to present to us.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I am coming to you from Victoria in British Columbia on the traditional and largely unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. And first I want to congratulate you on the work you're doing here. And as I do that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. It's very exciting to be part of this, and it's great to have this opportunity to explore what it means to be a healthy city. And my part in all of this is to give you the big picture and to look upstream at what's happening and put it all in a global context. So with that, I will get underway here. You will, incidentally, I'm going to go through a lot of slides very quickly, but the organizers do have the PowerPoint and you're welcome to share it, welcome to look at it. I've also got about 25 slides in the slideshow that I won't be sharing on screen that provide additional and background information. So I love the idea of this, and a city where you can live and thrive and age well is what it's all about. As I said, I'm the first of 3 presenters, and my job is to give the global picture. Tomorrow, Kim Rain is going to be talking about acting on imagination and what does it take to create and bring together an imagined future. And then Joyce Tang will talk about applying evidence-based research. So we're going from the global to the local, which is very appropriate. And this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you a bit of context. I'm going to talk about 3 big challenges as I see it and have seen it for some years for cities, and then talk about new and emerging ideas around a well-being society and a well-being city, and end by talking about finding hope and seeing opportunities, because we're also facing many challenges and it can be overwhelming. So a bit of context and history. First of all, when we talk about the health of a population, it's not all that widely understood that it's not much about healthcare. Thomas McEwen back in the 1970s showed that it was not vaccines and antibiotics largely that defeated infectious diseases in the Victorian era and into the early 20th century. but it was food and nutrition, it was hygiene, it was economic development, and those are the things, among others, that led to improved health. And more recent estimates, about 8 years ago now, a summary of some of those estimates suggests medical care only explains 10 to 20% of health over the life course. So of course that raises the question of what really determines the health of a community such as Lethbridge. And back in 1986, at the same time as we started Healthy Cities, we also started the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion. And this had a set of prerequisites for health. And so this list here is largely based on that. Starting with peace, which of course, with current events in Ukraine is particularly apparent as a prerequisite for health, but also food. And as Michael Pollan put it, real food, not too much, and mainly plants. And I'll come back to that point, but moving to a more plant-based diet is one of the things we have to do globally and in Canada as well, of course. Shelter is a prerequisite of health, clean air and water and sanitation, education, an adequate income, safe living and working conditions, and basic healthcare. So making basic needs for all, and you'll notice that basic healthcare is one of those, but it's only one of them. And then beyond that, and introduced for the first time in the Ottawa Charter, is the idea that we also need sustainable resources and stable ecosystems. So if you're talking about the health of your community, this is the big picture context in which you need to be thinking about it. And where we live matters. It's really important to understand that. In Canada, we're 80% urbanized, and we spend 90% of our time indoors. And if you don't believe that, try keeping a time diary and see where you actually spend your time. And of the remaining 10%, we spend half of it in vehicles in Canada. So we actually only spend, on average, in Canada, about an hour a day outdoors. And of course, since we're 80% urbanized, that's mostly outdoors in an urban setting. So the built environment is a massive factor in determining the health of our populations. But we also need to remember that we live 100% of the time within natural ecosystems. And it's those that I want to particularly focus on today. The second key point in terms of context and background is that health is created in and by cities. Again, we're 80% urbanized. So for 80% of us who live in urban areas, that's really important. It's not a new idea. Almost 150 years ago now, Benjamin Ward Richardson wrote a wonderful report that has been a beacon for my work over the decades, Hygeia, a City of Health, in which he described in 1875 what a healthy city would look like. Just over a century ago here in Canada, through the Commission on Conservation, there was discussion about how cities are important for health and the idea of what Charles Hodgetts called the city healthy. And then, of course, in 1986, the WHO Healthy Cities program, which actually was rooted in some ideas that we were developing in Toronto in 1984 and became a European project in 1986. So the notion that health is created in and by cities is not a new one, but it's a very important one. And when Len and I wrote that initial background paper for the WHO Healthy Cities project, we created this definition of a healthy city, which still holds an important place in the understanding. And I just want to emphasize 2 points here. First is a healthy city is really a process. It's not a status. It's not something you are and then you can forget about it. A healthy city is continually, and that's part of what makes it healthy, continually trying to be more healthy. And secondly, what we're talking about here is health in a very broad sense of well-being, which I'll talk about later. And we put it in terms of enabling people to develop to their maximum potential, whatever their maximum potential may be. So this is the context for talking about healthy cities, that most of the determinants of health are not healthcare, they lie beyond healthcare, and that cities play a very important role and must maintain a continual process of improving their environments and the health of the people who live within them. So let me come to three 21st century challenges for cities. And I want to put this again in a global context. In September of last year, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, presented a report, Our Common Agenda, to the UN General Assembly. It had been requested by the UN General Assembly. And he identified three big challenges for humanity. The first, the climate crisis, and more broadly, what he called our suicidal war on nature and the collapse of biodiversity. Secondly, unchecked inequality, which in his view, in the view of the UN, is undermining social cohesion and creating fragilities that affect us all. And then thirdly, technology. I'm not going to be talking about technology, but I am going to be talking about the first two a great deal. Now, back in 2017, 2018, in a new journal called Cities and Health, I wrote three pieces that summarize these challenges, or the three challenges as I see them, for healthy cities in the 21st century. The first is the emergence of the Anthropocene, and I'll talk more about that. The second is the growing inequality. So on those two, very much in line with the UN. The third, as I see it, is that we have, both at the city level and all the way up to the global level, a governance system that is largely ecologically blind so far. It's just beginning to be ecologically sensitive now, and is focused on economic rather than human and social development. So we need to change our government system to recognize and incorporate the emergence of the Anthropocene and to address the challenge of growing inequality. So let me talk about the emergence of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is an ecological, a geological, but also a social or even cultural phenomenon. And it is much bigger than just climate change. So we talk a great deal about climate change, but it's not just climate change. We're changing the Earth's natural systems in many ways. There's a concept of planetary boundaries. These are some of the key planetary boundaries. We're crossing or approaching these planetary boundaries in a number of areas. So climate change, ocean acidification, ozone layer depletion and resource depletion, pollution and ecotoxicity being the contamination of entire ecosystems, including our bodies, because we sit at the top of food chains with multiple persistent organic pollutants. And then finally, species extinction, that loss of biodiversity that the UN Secretary General talked about. And these are all happening at the same time. And this is what's called the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch in which all of these changes are being reflected in the geology layers that we're laying down. And we're beginning to realize that this constitutes an existential challenge, perhaps not to humanity, but certainly to our societies. In the report, Our Common Agenda, the UN Secretary General referred to it as the triple crisis of climate disruption, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And so it is that we have to address, and we have to address it at all challenges, at all levels rather, from local to the global. Another really important point about the Anthropocene is that it is both the scale but also the rapidity of this change. And this is a chart from one of the key groups working in this area, and they refer to this as the Great Acceleration. On the left, you'll see a set of socioeconomic trends, such as population and GDP and energy use and water use and international tourism and so on. And on the right, a set of Earth system trends, many of those same systems that I just talked about. And you'll see that in all of the charts, 1950 is highlighted, because it is suggested that the Anthropocene, that geological epoch, can be dated to starting in the mid-20th century, which incidentally is when I was born. I was born in 1948. So I am, if you like, the Anthropocene. So you can see the kind of hockey stick, so-called hockey stick curve in many of these areas, the rapid kick up in socioeconomic trends and the rapid kick up in environmental impacts since the 1950s. Not that they weren't happening before, but they accelerated greatly, except for bottom center domesticated land. So this is the challenges we face. And again, Guterres summed it up he's getting to be very good at summing things up very bluntly and succinctly. The state of the planet is broken. Humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. So this is the challenge that we face in terms of the Anthropocene. We need to remember that what it's all about is this. It's all about the one planet that we have to live on, our home. But in Canada, we act currently as if we had this. Our ecological footprint is almost 5 planets worth of biocapacity every year. And that's some data from 2016. So it's probably a bit bigger than that by now. So we have to get to what many people are now calling a one planet society, a one planet community. We have to think about a one planet Canada, a one planet Lethbridge. What is our fair share of the Earth's biocapacity? It is not 5 planets. If the whole world lived the way we live, we'd need 4 more planets. We don't have them. So we're going to have to reduce our ecological footprint in high income countries, and particularly Canada, which has one of the highest footprints in the world. We're going to have to reduce our ecological footprint by 70 to 80%, and quite rapidly. That is the challenge we face, and it is a challenge for cities, just as it is a challenge for provinces and the country and the world as a whole. The second big challenge that we face is growing inequality. This is a chart that shows the distribution of both income and wealth. It comes from the World Poverty Report, which was published earlier this year from the World Poverty Institute. And you can see here, in terms of income, the bottom half of the world's population get only 8.5% of all of the income. The top 10% get 52%. So we have massive inequality in income. Similarly, in fact, even more starkly in wealth. The bottom 50% of the world's population hold 2% of the world's wealth. The top 10% hold 76% of the world's wealth. So these are the levels of inequality that we're facing. They are similar, but not quite as dramatic in Canada. So this is just restating what you saw in that chart. I won't keep this up here. When you look at wages and dividends in the G7, for example, between 2011 and 2017, Oxfam report from 2020 shows that average wages grew 3%, while dividends to wealthy shareholders grew 31% over that period. So we have some very dramatic systemic inequalities built in to, in this case, high income countries, the G7, of which Canada is a member. And then in Canada, the top 1% own significantly more wealth than the bottom 70%. So those levels of inequality in income, in wealth, and thus in power, let's face it, are very dramatic. And this is reflected also in health. So this is some data. It's the latest data that's available. Unfortunately, it's rather old by now, from a StatScan report in 2015, showing the life expectancy by neighborhood. And what you will see is that on the left, the lowest income neighborhoods, male life expectancy was 75 years and female 81 years. But on the right, you can see a considerable difference. In fact, the male differential is 4.7 years of life expectancy between highest and lowest quintiles, that is to say 20% groupings, and for female 2.3 years. So we have not only inequalities in wealth, but they translate into inequalities in health. And this is seen at a very local level. So here, a recent study looking at life expectancy in Metro Vancouver in 2016. And here you can see the gap in life expectancy ranged from 6.9 to 9.5 years. And in fact, that inequality has been widening, the report's authors said, in recent years. And then, of course, we have the very dramatic inequalities in health among Indigenous people. Again, this is from a StatScan report, and you can see that for First Nations, for Métis, and for Inuit, the first 3 bars, compared to the total population, the crosshatched bar on the right side of each chart, the difference in life expectancy. So for males, for First Nations, the gap was 6 years, for Métis 5 years, for Inuit people 15 years, and for females 5, 3, and 10 years. So we have very dramatic inequalities reflected here. And what are those inequalities due to? Well, in a paper from 2017, and there are many similar papers out there, research indicates that colonialism and its associated processes are important determinants of Indigenous people's health internationally, including colonial policy, child welfare systems, residential schools, and the concept of historical or intergenerational trauma. So what happens socially, what happens economically is reflected in the health of people, and harm manifests in health ways, and it includes in mental health ways too. This from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, that our legislation and policies aimed at assimilation have contributed to high rates of mental health problems, addictions, and suicide among Indigenous people. So all of that is context for what we're facing. We also see it manifesting in what is being called ecological inequality. So similar to the income inequality, these are the contribution of various income groups to world carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions. And the bottom 50% contribute 12% to carbon emissions, whereas the top 1% contribute 17% of emissions. So again, inequalities in wealth are reflected in inequalities in ecological impact. That also manifests itself in terms of climate change. The WHO's special report on climate change in October found that the people whose health is being harmed first and worst by the climate crisis are the people who contribute least to its causes. And this is true both across countries and within countries in disadvantaged communities as well. Similarly for pollution, pollution disproportionately kills the poor and the vulnerable. Nearly 92% of pollution-related deaths globally occur in low and middle income countries, but also in countries at every income level, disease caused by pollution is most prevalent among minorities and the marginalized. So our social and economic conditions have significant health impacts. All of which to me argues for the importance of choosing the right focus for governance. Now, governance can be described very simply as the management of the course of events in a social system. And a UN Habitat report 20 years ago described governance of cities in terms of the many ways that individuals and institutions, both public and private, plan and manage the common affairs of the city. So what's really important here to understand is governance is not simply city government. Governance is the individuals and institutions, both public and private in the city, working together to maximize the well-being. So that list that Heather read off at the beginning of all the people involved in this is very impressive and very important. That's your governance system for your city. So governance is really important. The question is, what business should we be in governance, both at a local level and nationally and globally? Are we really only in the business of growing the economy, of growing material wealth and consumption, or making war on nature? Or should we be, if you like, growing people, maximizing people's human potential through human and social development? Should we be enabling everyone to thrive? Should we be in the business of preserving and restoring nature and making peace with nature? And obviously, I'm arguing that it is this latter form of focus that governance should be all about. In other words, we need governance for well-being, which takes me to the final segments of my presentation. I wanted to talk about the idea of a well-being society and a one planet city. So in December of this year, or November, the World Health Organization held its 10th Global Conference on Health Promotion, and that resulted in the Geneva Charter for Wellbeing. And what this talked about was the urgency of creating sustainable wellbeing societies that are committed to achieving equitable health now and for future generations without breaching ecological limits. So there again, the two big challenges are equity, addressing inequalities in health and in wealth and power, and doing this without breaching the ecological limits of the one planet. And they went on to say a healthy planet is essential to the health and well-being of current and future generations and for enabling all to flourish. So when you talk about being a flourishing city, you have to think of it in this context. So the Charter then went on to talk about 5 areas for a 21st century health promotion response. I'm only going to talk about the first 3 very briefly. Valuing, respecting and nurturing planet Earth and its ecosystems, designing an equitable economy, or I would say an economy fit for the 21st century, and developing healthy public policy for the common good. And there I'm going to focus in on local policy. So I mentioned earlier that Antonio Guterres had said that humanity is waging war on nature. He went on to say in that speech in 2020 that making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. It must be the top priority for everyone, everywhere. And that, of course, includes Lethbridge, as it does Victoria. So this was followed up by a report from the UN Environment Programme called Making Peace with Nature, came out towards the middle of 2021. And on the right, you will see that this needs to focus not on transforming nature, but on transforming humankind's relationship to nature. That is the key to a sustainable future. And within that notion of transforming humankind's relationship with nature, we need to look at environmental conditions and human well-being together. We can't separate out the social and the ecological. They are completely intertwined. And there's a section in there, I'm not going to read that bit to you, but there's a section in there specifically about cities and settlements. So these are some of the ideas that cities need to engage with. And they need to do so, incidentally, in this context, which I found very helpful. It comes from the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission some years ago. And I want to emphasize the point in the second sentence of that first paragraph that if human beings resolve problems between themselves but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. And they went on to say that reconciliation will never occur unless we are also reconciled with the earth. So again, the two interlinked, the social and the ecological. So that leads to ideas, among other things, to go to the second of the strategies of the Geneva Charter on Wellbeing, of designing an economy fit for the 21st century. The Worldwide Fund for Nature said it really well in their 2014 Living Planet report. Ecosystems sustain societies that create economies. It does not work the other way around. So we tend to think of the economy first. Who's the most important minister after the prime minister? Often the finance minister. What do we pay most attention to? The budget. Okay, but in reality, the economy is simply a social construct. We invented it, we created it, we can reinvent it, we can recreate it. It exists within that social domain, but all of that exists within the far larger ecological domain. So ecosystems sustain societies that create economies. It does not work the other way around. One recent interesting manifestation of this is the notion of Doughnut economics put forward by Kate Raworth a decade or so ago. It's really very simple. We need an economy on the one hand that is large enough to encompass at the center what she calls the social foundation. Those are largely, incidentally, the determinants of health that I talked about earlier. They are the basis of the social dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time, our economy can't exceed an ecological ceiling. That if it does, then we hit all of those ecological problems which are around the outside, which I also have touched on earlier, those planetary boundaries. So again, we have to be thinking about the social and the ecological together. And of course, a piece of that is it has to be about the redistribution of our wealth and capacity and resources to address equity issues. I did a whole paper on this for the National Collaborating Centre for Healthy Public Policy, which you can look up and read if you want more detail. But let me bring this down in closing, or beginning to close anyway, to the notion of healthy one planet communities. And the first point is this: no city is an island. So Lethbridge doesn't exist in a vacuum. Lethbridge exists in the context of Alberta, in the context of Western Canada, in the context of Canada and North America, in a global context. And you are influenced by all of those factors, as well as contributing to all of them. Secondly, global issues, such as the ones I've just described, are also local issues. And we, again, cannot easily any longer separate the global and the local. And thirdly, as high-income countries with large ecological footprints and who have historically contributed much of the CO2 that is warming the planet, we must lead the change. We can't look to middle and low-income countries to lead the change. We have to lead the change because we have a moral responsibility, I would say, to do so. So how do we reduce our ecological footprint to the equivalent of one planet while ensuring good health and a good quality of life for everyone? I would say that is the central challenge facing Lethbridge, facing cities across Canada, facing our whole country. How do we do this? And that is going to be a really important aspect of creating a healthy Lethbridge. Locally here in Saanich and in Victoria, a few years ago, they did the ecological footprint. We have around 4 planets worth because we have hydroelectric largely, our electricity is largely hydro, and also because we have a somewhat milder climate. But nonetheless, we have a 3 to 4 planet impact. But note, at a city level, 44% of that is due to food. So food, which you touched on earlier, is going to be really important. How do we change our diet? How do we follow Michael Pollan's advice and eat mostly plants? That's one of the key challenges, because that's a key contributor both to climate change, the high meat diet we have, but also to other ecological challenges. Secondly is transportation. Third is buildings. And fourth is consumables. Those are the big components of the ecological footprint. And if we look at those, about 3/4 of the food footprint is due to meat or animal-based diets, meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. About 3/4 almost of the transportation footprint is due to private vehicles, and about 3/4 of the buildings footprint is due to operating energy. So those are the big things we're going to have to look at. But we should think about that in the context of health co-benefits. So this is one of the interesting things that's happening. There are health co-benefits to a sustainable food system. On the right is the new Canada Food Guide chart, and it is actually largely a sustainable food system diet, but it wasn't created with sustainability concerns. It's created with concerns around health. So there's the two things tend to go together. Again, the health co-benefits of active and public transportation, biking, walking, blading, all of those, but that depends on how you design your cities and how you design your transport systems. And then the health co-benefits of clean energy for buildings and for other uses. So one of the things, the central message is creating a more sustainable community is creating a more healthy community. And in terms of the things that were suggested for Saanich and Victoria, it was to eliminate fossil fuel emissions in buildings, to convert half of gasoline private vehicles to electric, to reduce purchase of non-food consumables by 30%, reduce meat and dairy by 25%, and purchase 25% less food. We have a huge level of food waste in our society too. 40 to 60% of food in the end gets wasted from the field to the plate, which is staggering when you think about it. Okay, let me try and draw this quickly to a conclusion. This is the notion of one planet living. It comes from an NGO in the UK called Bioregional. What I want to stress here is that the first 3 points here are about the social conditions of living, about health and happiness, equity and economy, culture and community. And then you get on to the more traditional environmental factors of land and water and food and transport and so on. And of course, zero carbon energy. So these are some of the principles by which we need to design our living. They are also health principles. They also result in improved health and well-being. And here in BC, we now have a One Planet BC program. You can look it up. It's through an NGO in Vancouver called One Earth. And in Saanich, Saanich was the first municipality in Canada to adopt a One Planet approach. Maybe you could be the second. Incidentally, Nanaimo, to the north of us, was the first municipality in Canada to adopt Doughnut economics as a planning framework. And right at the center of this picture is the mayor of Saanich, Fred Haynes, and Colin Plant, the chair of the Capital Regional District, the regional government. So they are involved in all of this. I'm going to draw this to a close now. I'm going to talk about, finally, the idea of coming out of Doughnut economics, in fact, of what they call a city portrait, which tries to answer the question, and this is a question I leave with you in Lethbridge: how can our city be a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And that is the challenge. And the way that they suggest we do that is to answer these four questions: local and global, social and ecological questions. What would it mean for the people of this city to thrive, but also what would it mean for this city to respect the well-being of people worldwide? And then what would it mean for this city to thrive within its natural habitat? And what would it mean to respect the health of the whole planet? So those are some key questions and challenges you might want to think about. I do want to just end with this slide, which is to say that in all of these challenges, we also have to see the potential for hope and for opportunity. That, and I love this phrase, hope is the commitment to positivity in the face of adversity. What I have outlined is a lot of challenges, a lot of adversity, but I think that you can help to demonstrate what it means to maintain positivity in the face of adversity by facing these challenges and finding ways to create a healthy, thriving Lethbridge. And remember, as Albert Einstein said, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. So I wish you well in your deliberations over the next 3 days, and hope that this and the following presentations and discussions will help you frame this sense of how do you make Lethbridge that thriving, healthy city that you'd like it to be. And again, congratulations for even considering this question. It's a great thing to be doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hancock. That was excellent. I learned something every time I listen to you. The Wellbeing Society, and just taking a look at that. I'm just, Mark, do we have time for some questions from the audience?
We have a few minutes.
Thanks, Mark. Are there any questions for Dr. Hancock? You can write them in the chat box or feel free to unmute your mic.
I'll put your hand up, I guess, if you know how to do that on the reactions button.
It's Kathy Lewis, Dr. Hancock.
Go ahead.
Not sure. Okay. I really appreciate your comments this morning, and I was also encouraged with Mayor Higgins' initial comments about the planning that the city is doing. And I think that I'm encouraged with what you also added to that. And I think that my impression is that it's a great beginning for our city to have some of the elements that you described. And my question to you is, you've had lots of experience. Can you talk about successes in some of the cities that you have seen who have and are in the process of adopting what you're talking about this morning?
Yes, well, two come to mind in particular. One is Horsens in Denmark. The other is in Waterloo region in Ontario. And in both cases, what stood out for me in those cities was their level of civic engagement, not just the municipal government, but across the public and private sectors and with citizens in creating a shared vision. And that shared vision became a motivating factor. In the case of Woolwich Township in Waterloo region, that vision was still guiding their work 20 years later, because I was back there. In the case of Horsens, they set up what they called a healthy city shop. And what they did was they created a storefront, and they were a city of 70,000 people, so a bit smaller, in fact, than you, but comparable. They set up a healthy city shop, which was a joint initiative of a local private sector-based foundation and the city government. And it was a place where you could go to talk about how to create a healthy city. But what their approach was, if you came in and said there's litter on the streets, they didn't say, okay, we'll fix it. They'd say, well, how can we work together to solve that problem? So it was engaging citizens in problem solving, not just in saying, don't worry, we'll fix it for you. I thought that was very healthy and imaginative. That's just a couple, but there's many others. I saw Alan Friesen has his hand up, so Alan? Yeah, we're not hearing you. Okay, well, I will jump then to a question from
Ulysses.
From Ulysses. Sorry, I couldn't quite read that. What would the transportation priority be for an equitable one planet city? The transportation priority would be to build smaller, compact, multi-function neighborhoods and communities so that you could walk, bike, blade as much as possible. Now, obviously, biking in the middle of an Alberta winter is not the easiest thing to do, so you have to be thinking about that as well. But in Melbourne, for example, and elsewhere in the world, they are talking about what they call 15-minute neighborhoods. So how do you design your neighborhoods so that most of what you need on a daily basis is within a 15-minute walk or bike or bus ride of where you live? And obviously, you'll never get that 100%, but trying to make that an approach is quite a useful one. And obviously, if you're going to have cars, well, if you build urban sprawl, you have to have cars. So you need compact development. You don't want to sprawl, which also takes up a lot of valuable farmland anyway. And so you want compact multi-use communities that are walkable and bikeable. And I would also add human scale. And within that, you can then design a transportation system that is ecologically sustainable and healthy for people. I always used to joke, you know, running for the bus is good cardiovascular exercise. Maybe you don't want everybody running for the bus, but I mean, the point is getting out there, being active, as the mayor talked about, is really important. Diane.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hancock. I'm really quite interested in your perspective of what has happened in Nanaimo with using the Doughnut economic framework. Do you see any downsides to that work, or is it or what would you suggest to get started with using that approach?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to get familiar with the concept of Doughnut economics. Yes. And there is something called the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, which is where that report on the City Portrait comes from. We've actually been working with them too locally, because we've been looking at the Doughnut economy here, and we've been involving, for example, the South Island Prosperity Partnership in looking at that. It's early days, and it's early days even in Nanaimo. They've been at it for about a year. But it does mean you look at how do we reduce the ecological footprint of our economy locally? How do we enhance its social contribution And of course, how do you keep people employed, or how do you keep an income maintained? They're not easy questions, and not all of them are amenable to city solutions, of course. Things like income support are not really a city mandate, but we do need to be thinking about what sort of economy at a local level as well as nationally and globally. But I think take a look at the Nanaimo City website and get in touch with them. I think you'd find that very worthwhile.
Terrific. Thank you.
I've got a note here. We probably should move on. I see that Al and Gil have both posted questions in the chat box. Mark, do we have time to answer those, or?
If Dr. Hancock, if you wouldn't mind responding to the chat and typing your responses there, then everyone can read them. But we can shift gears a little bit here and move to the citizen part.
Yeah. So